Good afternoon and welcome to this session on data consent mechanisms for emerging economies. Today is the last day of RAISE 2020, in which we have seen multiple sessions covering various aspects of artificial intelligence, and we have seen an array of experts who have dwelled on all the possible issues related to artificial intelligence and data science. Today on this session on data consent mechanism for emerging economies, we have a distinguished panel of experts who will be deliberating on the issue of related to data and consent management. We have Mr. Kris Gopalakrishnan, who will be delivering the keynote address today. He is the global business and technology thought leader, co-founder Infosys, currently chairman of Axilor Ventures, and he chaired the committee on non-personal data, which is going to set up a framework and mechanism for sharing of non-personal data. Then we have the moderator of today's panel discussion, Professor V. Kamakoti, who is a professor at IIT Madras. His expertise in VLSI design, high-performance computing, algorithms, and data structures. And he was been a key member of the Arogya Setu team and has been the architect of the Itihas framework for predicting emerging hotspots, which has greatly helped in controlling the pandemic in many states across the country. Then we have Mr. Sidharth Shetty, who is a fellow at iSpirt, is a contributor to India's stack for transforming services with open APIs. We have Dr. Geetha Manjunath, who is the CEO and CTO of Niramai, which has developed a novel breast cancer scanning solution with AI and machine learning tools. We have Rahul Matthan, the co-founder Trilegal, his expertise on technology, data protection, outsourcing, and emerging technologies, and he has been a part and parcel of the various frameworks that we create in the government. Mr. V. Ramakanth is the CEO of Wysa, a mental health AI startup which has tools which can address issues relating to anxiety and isolation support, and it brings with him more than 20 years of experience in technology and related fields. Then we have Mr. Varad Pande, who is a partner of Omidyar, is expertise in designing projects that can be delivered at the bottom of the pyramid. So we have an array of experts, and I'm sure with their expertise and with their skill sets and with their experience, we will be having a very motivating panel discussions. So without wasting any more time, we straight away go to Mr. Kris Gopalakrishnan, chairman and co-founder of Axilor Ventures, who would be giving the keynote on data consent mechanisms for emerging economies.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhishek ji. And, it's an honor and privilege for me to be part of this very illustrious panel led by our moderator, Professor Kamakoti. Incidentally, I'm an alumnus of IIT Madras, and so it's great to be with him on this panel. And I know many of the others also. Let me share my screen quickly. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about data consent mechanisms. Of course, the title says for emerging economies, and you will quickly realize that the whole data consent mechanism is evolving even in advanced economies, even in developed economies. And hence, when I talk about data consent mechanisms, I'll talk about, for all the countries actually. And it's very good to know that India is actually not behind. In some sense, India is on par with some of the developed economies in terms of coming up with consent mechanisms for data. I'm going to touch upon, as was requested, the whole area of data consent very broadly. Then I'll briefly touch upon some of the emerging frameworks for this. And then I'll jump into some of the thoughts that our committee, and Abhishek ji talked about that, committee on non-personal data framework, discussed. We have released the recommendations. We have received actually significant, about 1400 plus feedbacks and comments, which we are now sorting through in order to see how we need to incorporate some of the good suggestions that have come into the framework itself. So let me jump into this. I want to start by actually looking at the plethora of consents, implicit, explicit, that we are all today giving actually. On the bottom right side, you see cookies, right? Many of us seen these messages and we just click it. I don't know how many of the people have actually gone in and saw, what is the cookie policy, what it means, etc. But we just simply click, not even knowing what data is being collected. Just on the left bottom is, and this you see in any software or hardware installation, can you share data for help improving the product quality, help improve the software, share debugging data, etc., etc. And again, most of the cases people don't understand that fully and they click it. On the top right side is, I browsed the net for certain products, and before I know it, I'm getting so many messages from so many different vendors asking me to buy their products actually. And I'm getting flooded with who has that product and what is available, etc. And the top left, which I left for the last, is an email I got recently, which told me that over the last 6 years, I've visited 11 countries, 81 cities, and 325 places. I didn't, I knew that, location is being tracked, but I didn't realize that somebody is keeping such a meticulous data about all the cities I've visited, all the places I've gone, etc., etc. Some I've implicitly consented, some I didn't realize that I've consented, some have actually started tracking even before the consent frameworks came about. So it's all over the place actually. Look at this. Data is being collected not just by online. Data is collected everywhere you go, including the financial institutions. The number of documents that you need to submit to open a bank account or do anything with a bank, retail and e-commerce businesses. Everybody wants your copy of your ID cards and things like that. Everybody, if you go to any shop, they actually refuse to check you out if you don't share your phone number, and they only want your mobile number, right? In of course airline, etc., because of the security concerns, again they want lots of data. Telecom, again KYC plus all kinds of information, including do you have the capability to pay. Hospitals, of course, collect data about not just ID, etc., but they have the data about your health records and things like that. Hotels, restaurants, and many others. Some of them are collected in physical locations, not in online locations, but they do collect data. And when we talk about a framework, we need to address these concerns. And this is something, again, in our committee we discussed about. So consent is the legal basis on which you provide any data processing services. That's the broad definition of consent. So for providing any data processing services, you require consent. That's the legal basis for providing that service. So collecting and processing data, typically the consent is actually for a limited purpose, but we don't realize that, and we don't have a mechanism to know whether the data is misused or not. We do not know where the data is shared with other let's say organizations in the background. And today data is a resource, it's a saleable commodity, so it is being shared extensively for it's marketed extensively for revenue purposes. We want to make sure that the consent clearly defines proper use and prevents misuse. The consent duration is important. For how long is this consent given? And very important, can you withdraw that consent? And is it easy to withdraw that consent, the right to be forgotten? Consent mechanisms vary depending on whether it's personal data or non-personal data. And India is one of the few countries which has actually ventured into the area of non-personal data. And I'll come to this when I go further. Professor Kamakoti, if you need to interrupt me, I crossed my time limit, just go ahead and we can go ahead. I'll quickly run through. There are examples, as I said, and most of the examples come from actually developed countries. EU has extensive set of documents on the whole area of data strategy, shaping Europe's digital future. Recently, of course, they have the GDPR regulations on personal data and consent framework around that. Um, Japan has and Finland has, and all of these address many different things. On the left side is various documents various countries have come up with, and they are towards data portability, because in some sense they want to give the choice to the entity for porting data from one service provider to another service provider, make it easy for that, seamless, or they want to make sure that data portability is built into the standards, sharing partnerships, both private and public sector, data for social good, data for public interest, mandated access needed to achieve social objectives and things like, for example, during COVID times, right? You want some mandated data sharing and things like that. And the government policy initiatives reveal 4 priorities: enhancing access to and sharing of public sector information. Many governments have talked about sharing public sector data. Then there is limited sharing in the private sector, just between private sector or private sector and public sector. What is important to realize about data is that when it's shared, and when you aggregate data, integrate data with multiple sources, the value of the data increases. Increasing data analytical capabilities across society, and during this COVID times, this is a clear reason for sharing data, and developing national data strategies and things like that. So in India, we had the Sri Krishna committee look at this and come up with the Personal Data Protection Bill, which is now going through the parliamentary process and things like that. The key elements of that: informed consent, specific purpose, clear and defined, there is clarity in the consent and things like that, capable of being withdrawn, which is the limited consent that you give, etc. And this is going through parliamentary process, etc. Some things which the Sri Krishna committee has not addressed or has left unaddressed in the report. One is, whom does this data belong to when it becomes anonymized? Second is this whole area of establishing the sovereign right of the country to formulate rules and regulations, etc. And some of these we have tried to address. Recently, of course, Niti Aayog has come up with the data empowerment and protection architecture, a secure consent-based data sharing framework. I will not go into that. Sidharth probably will talk more about that. And Sidharth will probably also talk about the National Digital Health Mission, which also has come up with the framework for consent manager, which is derived from the consent manager which MeitY has put out, etc. And it also has this anonymizer, which takes relevant data from electronic health records for anonymizing for public purposes and things like that. So all this is actually out there. Now I come to NPD, and the reason I want to touch upon NPD is introduce a couple of concepts. I won't take you through the entire set of recommendations that we have come up with, which try to address what we believe to be some of the challenges with the existing frameworks and existing regulations, etc. As I said, we have gone through consultations with private sector, public sector. We've gone through consultations with different countries, and I'm actually blessed. We believe we are blessed that we got 1,400 plus comments and suggestions, which we are now pouring through to understand what is relevant and what is not relevant, because we want to make sure that what we come up with can be implemented and will help all stakeholders as much as possible. The goal for any set of regulation is twofold. One is an enabling framework which allows data to be collected, processed, services to be delivered, economic value to be created, because the whole future depends, or part of the future depends on leveraging this data for value addition and things like that. We also want to create an enabling framework that allows data sharing, and especially I'll come to this actually, especially for specific purposes that we believe are good for the society, for increasing innovation, increasing entrepreneurship, etc. The goals of the regulations also include enforcing framework, means establishing rights of our data in a digital world. And these rights are rights to formulate rules and regulations, rights to enforce these rules and regulations, address the question of privacy, re-identification of, prevent re-identification of anonymized personal data, prevent misuse and things like that, because that is actually very, very important. Regulations also bring certainty, which is good for the business. And we want to be one of the first country to put in place a simple, comprehensive framework for the data economy, which we are already doing actually in financial sector, etc. The principles behind the regulations: sovereignty, benefit to India. Of course, we want to benefit the world also, increase innovation, create new models, algorithms, etc. Human centricity, give greater control to the individual, the entity over her data. Privacy, misuse, prevent de-anonymization. Simplicity, want to make sure that it's digital, unambiguous, entrepreneurial. Non-personal data is defined as data that is not related to an identified or identifiable natural person, and data that was initially personal data but later made anonymous. And the consent mechanism, why I believe there is a new consent mechanism required, is that for NPD there is no data principle, because all that is stripped out. It can be data about weather, it can be data from sensors and things like that, and it can be data which is anonymized. So there is no data principle, and so we need to define now who is the data principle, or who is the proxy for the data principle. Second, we need to also combine public and private data entities, especially when it comes to creating public goods and things like that. I talked about this, the need to establish the rights of India over the non-personal data collected and created in India, and we make some exceptions here. We make sure that if foreign data is brought to India, then that's not under this regulation. Similarly, a data about a foreign national collected in India is also actually not under this regulation. So we make some exclusions in the case of foreign entities. In that sense, we can bring data from other countries to process in India, etc. Also, we have made some distinction between data collected by private entities in public domain and private entities in private domain. An example is that if you put a sensor on a lamppost on the road, a private entity collecting in public spaces. But if you put that sensor inside your car and you collect that data, then it's private entity collecting in private domain, because the car also belongs to you. So, and we have also excluded the private domain data, which is proprietary to an organization, typically that's protected by IPR and things like that. These are some of the good suggestions that have come from the various feedback that we have got. So this is one very important thing that we brought about, and this is one point I want to make, and after that I can quickly conclude. See, everywhere the framework is a consent framework. I believe we need to shift from a consent framework, because all the challenges that I talked about, how complicated it is, and especially in a country like India, where literacy is not very high, understanding of the implications is not very high, language is not very clear, and lots of challenges exist. We need to shift to transparency, and we need to shift to checks and balances. We need to shift to the ability to audit and things like that. So we have defined what is called a data business. So anybody collecting data, including, you go to a retail store and they collect data, that organization will be deemed to be a data business. Now, in order to make sure that we do this, over time, we have actually identified a threshold above which they need to disclose this. They need to actually, mandatorily disclose that they are a data business. This is the data that they're collecting. So the data that they're collecting is actually disclosed, and we believe that this is actually the right direction in which to go. And we are seeing that now, regulations that are coming out of California, the regulations that are coming out of the EU actually talk about now disclosures and things like that. And it's very similar to if you buy a bottle of medicine, if you buy food products, the labeling of food products, medicine, etc., clearly establish what is there in that. And we believe that when it comes to data, we need to actually have disclosures about who is collecting what data, what does that data contain, etc. So as part of the initial registration, the data business would provide the following information. I will not go into details. And this is a public directory which is available to all people to query, which is available, and it's kept up to date by the the data controller on an ongoing basis, and the data principal then can actually go and see who is collecting what data. Public can go and see who's collecting what data, etc. And data business will also provide data that's required for public good, and that public good is the sharing purpose that I want to take you through. This is one form of consent mechanism which we are clear about. The consent mechanism for creating public data sets, which allow us to leverage this non-personal data. Now we have added an extra level of consent for anonymization because, as I said, once the data is anonymized, the identity is lost. So before, as part of the PDP, Personal Data Protection Act, is consent required. In that consent, the principal must know that his or her data is part of an anonymized database, and they must give explicit consent for that. Non-personal data derived from personal data, that's another reason why it should be given. And the consent mechanism is through a data trustee. I will not, again, with lack of time, will not go through details of this, but we have an explicit set of recommendations on how, using this mechanism, we can create high-value data sets. These are data sets for public purposes containing, let's say, genomics data, health data, transportation data, things like that, which can be used for both public and private parties for poverty alleviation, financial inclusion, agriculture development, etc., etc. So let me stop here by saying that the consent is required in today's world. Consent is actually varied and complex. Most of the countries are coming out with rules, regulations, and things like that on consent. India is not far behind. India is, in some sense, a leader here. We have come out with specific consent frameworks for financial data, health data, etc. Now, when it comes to broadening that, we believe that we need to move to a transparency-based regime, a transparency-based, disclosure-based regime, as well as specific consent for creating high-value data sets. Thank you very much.
Thank you for laying down the entire framework with regard to data sharing on the non-personal data. But many of the concepts that you shared will, especially with regard to consent, will also apply to personal data. So the issues have been laid down very clear. Now we'll need to kind of, especially with the more and more data being shared, more and more data science being used, more and more AI applications being built, what is the kind of data consent frameworks that we need to evolve, the guidelines that we need to evolve in order to ensure that the balance is there. And when we talk of data consent, of course, the issues of what is the fair consent, what's the informed consent, and what is the responsible consent. These are key pillars for responsible AI, which is a theme of this summit. So with this in background, I now would hand it over to Professor V. Kamakoti to moderate the panel discussion with the distinguished panelists. Over to you, Professor Kamakoti.
Thank you, Gopalakrishnan sir, for the wonderful keynote and setting up the stage for the panel. And we are very privileged to have you today. And thank you, Abhishek ji, for this opportunity. As clearly elaborated in the keynote, the topic of data consent mechanism is interesting and also very challenging. Interesting because it opens up many technical issues, both and technical and legal issues. The technical issues come from many aspects like data and consent mechanisms, while the legal issues come from many, and to mention an important few: privacy, anonymization, technically supporting processing and responsibility principles for various stakeholders. Today, as we look at specifically from the COVID challenge, the notion of a personal data, for example, if a person is suffering from a disease, what is the data that he can about him that could be shared is different from a person who is actually suffering from COVID, because he has the potential to actually spread the disease. And so there comes some sort of a moral responsibility to basically reveal at least the places he visited or the contact that he has traced. And the bigger challenge that comes here is, after you collect this data, there is a lot of things that we do on validation, standardization, correlation, archiving, distributing for public good, as many examples that the keynote speaker had put in the last slide, and making it accessible to all these organizations. And there we have to not compromise with this privacy and ethics. From a technology point of view, we have a lot of privacy preserving machine learning algorithms, specifically from an AI point of view, like federated learning, differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, etc. But from an actual implementation, the challenge is going to be on the scale. How do I have a scalable implementation? And especially a scalable consent mechanisms. Today, when we were deploying the Arogya Setu, can we get the consent of all the 1.4 billion people, if at all they are going to use it, on a single shot? And for every such emergency situation or a thing where we need on a very, very quick turnaround time, can we have certain scalable consent mechanisms? Specifically, the GDPR talks about compatibility assessments. This is a generic principle of sharing that they have agreed, and as long as the way we process the data or use the data adheres with those generic principles, we are free to use without a consent. So these are all some of the broad topics that we have. And so we have an exciting panel. Sidharth from iSpirt. Specifically, we request him how data consent policies will impact the startups in emerging economies. And too little regulation is bad, and too much regulation will impact time to market, permission checks, etc., licensing, if at all. And how do we draw such a line? I think that's something which we are very eager to hear from an iSpirit perspective. Of course, Dr. Geetha, you have done phenomenal work on the breast cancer detection. Data consent in the medical domain is not just numerical data, but we have images and these. So how do we actually get a consent mechanism for sharing this? Because finally, AI/ML algorithms can use this for diagnosis in a very big way. And what is the impact of this whole thing on the poor? Suppose we could get a very, very scalable AI tool for breast cancer detection using all these images, and then we can reduce the cost for the poor. So data consent mechanism will have an impact on the economy. And then Ramakanth, on your Wysa, especially you had actually gone through the rigor of satisfying a clinical safety standard, right? So we would like to listen from you. How do you convince people to trust and share data with confidence? So this is something that we are eager to listen from you. Rahul, of course, on the legal aspects of data sharing. Can we have a uniform policy or a configurable policy which is based on situation and domains, especially in case of COVID, the example that I maintained? And what is the pros and cons of having a uniform data policy versus a dynamically configurable data policy. And Varad, of course, on your voice of consumer, you have actually done a lot of behavioral analytics on consumer and what it means to for them to give a consent for sharing of data, what it means for them to actually even take data, what sort of data they need. So this is the sort of this topic being highly diversified. I think we also have people from different walks of life. With this thing, I first invite Sidharth to give his views on this topic.
Thank you so much, Professor Kamakoti, for giving me a chance, and Abhishek, sir, as well, for giving me a chance to speak at this panel. I'm Sidharth Shetty, a volunteer with the iSpirt Foundation. iSpirt is a non-profit technology think tank driven by volunteers and primarily focused on building out digital public infrastructure in the space of financial and health inclusion in India. So a few years back, what we noticed at iSpirt was that there was a paradigm shift around how data consumption was taking place in emerging economies. So if you look at developed markets, like let's take the United States or the UK, for example, wherein their individuals have high levels of discretionary income, when they became data rich, they were already economically well off, right? And therefore, what would happen is developers would create applications, use that to capture as much data about the user, and then based on that, personalize the ads that they showed to them and earn a commission on any good or service procured through those ads. And that's a hugely powerful and profitable business model. But if you look at the same set of companies, while they have some of their largest user bases in a market like India, at scale draw relatively piddly amounts of revenue. And that's because, at scale, Indians don't have high levels of discretionary income. And therefore, we felt, could we invert this entire paradigm where data, instead of traditionally being used to sell things to the user, is actually used to empower them to access better financial services by eliminating the asymmetry gaps in the market, bridging trust, access better health services through, remote care and now AI-assisted care, and various other socioeconomically important services that are relevant for that individual. Now, if that had to happen, the only way one could do that is if every individual was empowered with control over their data. And control essentially gets manifested through consent, where an individual has the ability in a safe, secure, and in an informed manner. Because as Kris mentioned in the early part of his presentation, Indians have diverse user experience needs. Some Indians may prefer a self-service flow in a particular language. Some Indians may prefer an assisted flow, and so on. And therefore, how do you enable informed consent experiences for 1.3 billion Indians such that in a safe, secure manner, they can share their information, like say your bank account financials, from one service provider to any other? And today the system is completely broken, right? So if you look at it from a personal data standpoint, if you just wanted to share your financial information, you would either give out your username and password. So, typically MSMEs give out their GST username and password, and third-party service providers screen scrape GST data, or individuals give out their bank account username and password, and third-party service providers screen scrape that data and create wealth management applications on top. Or you physically run around to different, bank branches, insurance branches, pension fund branches, and others, or you'll digitally run around to different portals, download these PDFs, take these printouts, create a folder, and upload it. So it's hugely broken, right? There's no consent. There is no purpose limitation to this data. It's non-machine readable, so it makes it difficult to pass it downstream. It's not digitally signed, so it's prone to fraud. And therefore, as we thought about the data empowerment and protection architecture, a key part of this became, could we, in an electronic manner, in a completely standardized way, create a framework where any citizen of India could authorize consent and share this information with anyone else, any other service provider. And therefore, the first step to do that was actually coming out with a national standard for electronic consent, which is what the Ministry of IT put together in 2016. And if you really look at it, India solved a similar class of problems in the payments world. So if you go back in time, in the old world of payments, you would actually, go to your bank, say log in through net banking, which is a horrible user experience, and then issue an instruction saying debit my account and credit this end destination. Now that doesn't scale. Most Indians don't know their net banking username and password. Banks are not going to innovate for the diverse front end needs that users have. But there are legitimate reasons for money to remain within the bank. Reasons of monetary policy, reasons of grievance redressal, reasons of overall financial stability. So therefore, in UPI, what essentially happened was the permission got unbundled from your bank account into third-party innovators like PhonePe, WhatsApp, Google Pay, Bheem, and others. So they don't sit on your money. They're not part of the money flow. But all they do is they collect your permission in an informed manner, in a way that meets your user experience criteria, right? And they collect that permission, capture it in a digitally signed way, and send that permission back to your custodian bank who's holding on your money, who will then verify it, validate it, and return, accordingly debit the money and credit it in near real time. And that's scaled extremely well. India is doing over 1 billion UPI transactions a month. We'll soon get to 1 billion a day. And we've essentially now generalized that same framework to data. So I'll just share a set of 3 slides that would bring this to life very quickly. So the way that's happening is you can think of it at 3 perspectives. There's the technology perspective. Second is the institutional perspective. So India's created a new class of institutions called consent managers that users will interact with. And third is the overarching law / from a technology perspective, like I mentioned, in 2016, the Ministry of IT put out a national standard for electronic consent, because consent otherwise is very abstract. What you may want to share where at the point of authorizing this data sharing instruction would be different from what I want to share, right? For what purpose, for what time period, for what data life. And one important point to bring up out here, which is a very nuanced point, is the notion of consent to collect versus consent to share. So fundamentally, the data empowerment and protection architecture addresses consent to share, which is saying, hey, if an individual wants to share, let's say, his bank account cash flow information with a lender to get a real-time loan offer, there needs to be a mechanism for that to happen in a safe, secure manner. But predominantly across the world, whenever people talk about consent, they talk about it in the old paradigm of consent to collect your information, as Kris had highlighted. And essentially what they do is they do a one-time capture of your consent and then collect large amounts of data for various abstract purposes. But now that you have a mechanism where in the context of every transaction, you can consent and share your information with very specific attributes, that now allows you to minimize the typical consent to collect experiences that are put out there, right? And now you can have for the transaction, rather than having those long terms and conditions, taking that upfront. And there may be legitimate use cases where that is required to be collected upfront. But in a lot of use cases, that can now become simplified in context consent to share experiences. And maybe Rahul, who's done a bunch of thinking around this, could also share that when he comes up in the panel. But essentially, simply put, India standardized this electronic consent. It's based on a set of principles that align with the Justice Sri Krishna bill. So it's an open standard. Consent is revocable. It's very granular. So you don't have to share your entire data set. You may choose to share parts of it. It's auditable. You get notified every time data is shared. And is it secure? So the end-to-end data flow is encrypted. And this consent artifact was then adopted by all the financial sector regulators. So at the level of the FSDC, so with RBI at the forefront, but it has SEBI, PFRDA, IRDA, and the Ministry of Finance as a part of it. And that's how the entire consent manager system for financial data was born. So consent managers for financial data are called account aggregators, and they are regulated by RBI. And there are 8 of them that have got an in-principle approval, 4 with an operational license. But essentially think of them like those UPI apps. So your data remains at source on the left-hand side with your bank, with your mutual fund, with your insurer. And you can now go to any account aggregator of your choice. And there's a market ecosystem of AAs. Like I mentioned, some AAs may innovate for individuals, some AAs may innovate informed consent experiences for MSMEs, since GST data is now a part of this system, and so on. And an individual can register with an account aggregator, discover and link their bank accounts. So the nation's largest financial institutions have plugged into this system. These include, on the public sector side, the likes of SBI, and on the private sector side, the likes of HDFC, ICICI, Axis Bank, IDFC First, IndusInd, and many others. And what then happens is when you've registered with your AA, you'll get a simple ID, which would be, for example, Sidharth at the rate of AA1. And now tomorrow I can go to a lender, and the lender, instead of saying, hey, please upload this entire folder, give me your account aggregator ID. And I give him my account aggregator ID. And in real time, the lender will send me a consent request saying, hey, data for this time period, for this purpose, under these conditions, do you authorize it, yes or no? And my account aggregator will notify me. And if I say yes, then in real time, that consent artifact that I showed you earlier is generated by the account aggregator, sent to the individual financial information providers, who will verify it, validate it, and then fetch the data in a machine-readable form, digitally sign that data, and then encrypt it. The entire data flow is end-to-end encrypted, and send it back to the lender. So this, of course, opens up a whole new opportunity in the space of cash flow lending, which has also been detailed out in the RBI UK SINA MSME committee report, but also various other use cases, especially for the various startups listening in the world of personal finance management, that can now come to life because of this infrastructure, wealth management, robo-advisory. And the same framework is now being applied to health as well. So on 15th August, Prime Minister Modi, when he launched the National Digital Health Mission, one of the crucial building blocks of that was the personal health record system, or the implementation of the consent framework for your health information. And this is being driven by the National Health Authority. They already have, it follows the same architecture. They already have a set of sandboxes up and running. And NHA would be the first consent manager for health information. So I'd strongly suggest you guys take a look at that, because that becomes key, especially for various, in COVID times, telemedicine use cases, but especially as we see a shift from diagnosis moving away from symptom-based towards biomarker-driven, which is hence it's essentially a set of metrics from the body, which you share that, you can now build AI models on top of it and use that to assist the clinical teams in. So that's just an overview on the end-to-end flow with which India has been rolling out consented sharing of data. This has also been implemented. When you think of it, what I've discussed so far is purely the regulated sectors of financial information, health, and TRI has announced the same for telecom data. But in some ways, this is also what DigiLocker, what the Abhishek and team at NEGD have implemented for establishing access to government data, your mark sheets, your certificates, your driver's license, a phenomenal amount of data sets that is now in an individual's control. And then through the passage of the Sri Krishna bill, this will address other unregulated categories of data, private categories of data going forward.
Thank you, Sidharth. Now, thank you for giving your overview of many things, and especially the account aggregator, which is coming out in a very big way, specifically with the growing NPS. I think it's going to become a very good regulatory mechanism for the banks, for the financial institutions. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. In fact, for loan monitoring, a lot of banks have signed up to use it to monitor their existing loan portfolio.
Okay. Thank you very much. And now I invite Dr. Geetha, specifically on the medical domain. How do you get consent, especially not just numerical data, but images? That's going to be a very important thing. And how do you go about it?
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Kamakoti, sir. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Kris, sir, and several dignitaries who are definitely more informed than me in the data protection. But what I'm going to give is more a practitioner's view of the data protection requirements and what we are doing today, and very happy to adopt the newer methods that are being proposed. With respect to the personal data protection bill, one thing just want to mention is that data such as biometric data, like health data, and some of these are considered as almost like sensitive personal data. So they have to be treated much more, very, very rigidly, just like financial data. So some of these form under that category, and so we need to be sort of very careful about how we handle it, Lee said. Having said that, like many of the panel members mentioned, when the data is anonymized, right? So where you're not able to identify whether an image, as you mentioned, if it's an image, if the image belongs to person X or person Y, then we can actually do a little bit, further sharing without affecting the end user who has consented to give that data as well. So I'll just go into a little bit more details into how this healthcare data is accessed, particularly when we are building AI models, or let's say in clinical trials where we are actually collecting this data to build AI models with ground truth and so on. So as has been practiced over decades now, any clinical trial, for example, where we actually take specific data about the patient for a specific reason, such as, let's say, build a cancer model. There we have, and then along with that, we also take data from other tests that are performed on the person, such as cancer, we say what's the biopsy data, what's the data, and all these by there is a requirement for specific format where we have the information, where all the reasons why we are collecting the data, what we're going to do with it, everything has to be described, even the type of model we are trying to build, as in like what kind of disease we are trying to do, trying to solve, and so on. Everything has to be described, as well as there is a full-formed patient consent that we have to take. And this needs to be done for, obviously, for every patient that's recruited. Whereas when it is more in terms of treatment or actually ongoing usage of a model that's already been built. So here, of course, like the previous speaker expert mentioned, right, the telehealth, the adoption towards telehealth, thanks to COVID and so on, is actually loosening up a little bit of a requirement, strict requirement of paper and pen kind of consent that was needed, particularly for, let's say, for an OPD patient. When a person walks into outpatient department, the fact that they walked in and sort of paid the bill itself was considered as a consent. Now, in a similar manner, what I believe is that, the telehealth regulations, if a person calls in rather than the doctor calls out, those kinds of minute differences are there. Just person calling in itself can be considered as a data consent mechanism for starting off the conversation and so on. So these are some minor, some changes we are seeing, which is also enabling additional adoption of telehealth. Having said that, any person who is collecting data for building AI models or providing health services should definitely make sure that the adequate protection for non-anonymized data is definitely maintained. Like, for example, we talk about data integrity, that is ensuring correct encryption of the data is done even at data, what you call as data at rest and data in motion. So all of these should be encrypted so that even if there is a manual, they cannot de-identify and then make a wrong usage of it, and essentially prevent misuse. And also authorized access to be provided, like in controls, and also learning at Niramai and how we are sort of trying to do this data consent mechanism. So, but when I do not want you to hold my data anymore, and I will have a power and right to basically destroy my personal data that is with you. So that also is something that the data fiduciary or the person who is actually protecting the personal data and analyzing it should ensure. And last but not the least, there was a reference to GDPR. And then what I understand from what are the GDPR gap analysis that we're doing for Niramai itself is that, they're not just about the data. It's also about your software that analyzing the data, right? Let's say, for example, there's a web service and you're allowing a login and password and so on. What is the password protection? So whether you are using that web service for uploading your data, viewing your data or not, the fact that some of the processing may happen after you log in and so on also restricts the overall structure of the software architecture itself, specifically in terms of exactly the different checkpoints for processing. Again, as I said, data at rest and movement and analysis and so on. So there are all of these rules in place. And obviously as startup, we find it really overwhelming to start focusing on all of these elements when we are trying to solve a small problem. Having said that, as healthcare startups, we definitely need to take care of that. Specifically with respect to Niramai, as many of you know, what we do is enable AI-based automatic analysis of thermal images so that we can do an end-to-end early stage breast cancer detection solution. All we do is just measure the temperature variations on the chest, and our AI models analyze to generate a report which says whether the person is likely to be malignant or any other breast health issues. And so in this regard, we conduct a lot of rural camps and also corporate camps, right, where the direct interaction with the consumer exists. Otherwise, we generally go through the hospital and the normal hospital or OPD process takes care of the data consent. But when we are actually directly interacting with the users, we done and how her data in an anonymized fashion will be used for building models which can help me more people in the world and so on. And then when she actually right now does a physical signature, so we actually take it. Of course, in corporate, we do follow the online data consent mechanism that was referred to before, where it's a normal terms and condition they agree to before even they get in. So this is regularly followed. And your question is about imaging, and so there are different types of images one can take, and let's say when you're taking thermal image, where taking a picture of your face as well is you're not able to identify who the person is because many people look similar, right? So it probably also qualifies as anonymized data, but as long as the image is in such a way that you're not able to identify the actual person basis that, then the normal process of processing the anonymized data, the kind of protections that we need to take care of for that applies. Not really, it is not a PII anymore. And so that is I guess a good way of using AI for, let's say, X-ray images, thermal images, and so on. But when you do face recognition or any of these other applications, we have to be very sort of, conscious that it is actually a PII as well. And of course, we have better data experts on the panel, and we could discuss more about this. So one other last point I want to mention here is about when we use these consented data in an anonymized manner to build AI models, this will eventually can be used for providing scalable, affordable healthcare. And so that the reason why we are collecting and building these AI models is to actually make a lot more real impact in the social sector or in general for people who are using these models later on. So keeping this in mind, right? Many patients are willing to provide consent. Now, why you are collecting data is very important. Of course, data is the commercial usages of data. So again, it's very whether whether there's what kind of what would be the motivation for the end user or that's and when we explain these things, it's also easily obtainable as well. Happy to answer any other questions in this regard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Geetha, and specifically with the ensuing National Digital Health Mission. I think the experiences that you have and the points you have raised will add a lot more value, especially from the data consent point of view. Now we move on to Sri Ramakanth, especially that you have gone through the test of getting a clinical safety standard, right? And how do you basically convince people to trust and share data with confidence?
Thank you, Professor Kamakoti, and hello everyone. It's a great honor to be here. So I wanted to spend the time I have allotted to very quickly give you a sense of what we are trying to do. I think similar to I think my earlier panelist Geetha, my perspective is more of a practitioner. So I think as a startup, we are grappling with data consent, data privacy issues, and the problem statement for us is usually how do we even start, and what is the roadmap we adopt towards data consent, and gradually build up in sophistication, gradually build up in awareness, and building. I think it's almost a ladder where you're building trust with the user, and over time you're reaching a point where you can start saying that now I'm ready for adoption by a healthcare system. So I think my attempt is to very quickly give you a sense of what Wysa does, my the company which I work for, and from there how we are thinking about data consent. And I think in terms of some of the audience here who might be startup founders or folks working in medical technologies and thinking about how to think about this problem, hopefully that will be of some use. So if I just quickly share my screen and see if I can do that right away. I think I'm having some trouble on sharing my screen. 1 second.
You can just email
do
us.
I have? Yeah, do I have?
You can just email us and we can share it for you. Or send up.
Actually, I think I got it. Sorry, please pardon me.
I think you should be able to share.
Matthan, you can just email us.
Yeah, let me email it to you. And in the meantime, let me start talking in any case. So effectively, what I wanted to talk about is Wysa as a product is available as a AI-enabled chat platform, which is offering services to, which is basically offering an anonymous, empathetic conversational agent, which is allowing people to talk about what is bothering them. And it is AI driven. It's a chatbot, which is offering an kind of an anonymous, safe listening experience, and where, for example, a B2C user can start talking to it, and you download an app. It's available in an app format, and you download the app. You start talking. You talk about it. You can use it for venting. You can use it for creating some kind of basic availing of certain tools, and offering some basic therapy services as well. And here, just 1 second, please. Let me just carry on. I'm not being able to find if there's something wrong with my computer.
You can send it as email. We will share it for you. Can you send it as email? You can send it to my email address also.
Sorry. actually a very large file because I had a demo embedded inside it.
Nice. Still straight. So that we could share.
So effectively, what Wysa is offering is an anonymous chat platform, which is creating this empathetic listening experience. And one of the things which we found was that obviously, in terms of mental health, one of the biggest issues is stigma, not only just denial or ignorance, but people wanting to come forward and talk about what is bothering them. And here, one of the biggest, I think, design challenges or the design decisions we took was to make the user completely anonymous. So at one stroke, you are handling a lot of the PII issues which are coming forward, and saying that if we tell the user, if we communicate this to the user, saying that you are not required to disclose who you are, there is no OTP verification, there is no email verification, and there is no provision of PII, personally identifiable information. You can actually just download the solution and start processing it as you start, and you give yourself a nickname, and from that point onwards, you can start talking about what is bothering you, and you can start availing of services. And that, I think, was the biggest innovation for us, because communicating this in the entire marketing material, the app store, the Play Store fronts, the on the App Store as well as on Google Play, and communicating, reassuring the user, saying that they would stay anonymous, was, I think, one of the biggest issues or one of the biggest hurdles we overcame initially. And it led to a huge amount of adoption. I think in B2C now, Wysa has about 2.5 million users, where and we've had about 100 million plus conversations on the platform. And from that point onwards, what happened was, as our requirements became more sophisticated, and as we started going and talking to enterprise clients, this was discovered, for example, by the NHS in the UK, the National Health Service, and they started recommending this and offering it to their patients. And at that point, we started running into questions around data consent or data privacy in a more sophisticated manner, in a more and where we needed to create or evolve a slightly more, uh, I think, sophisticated approach. And there, one of the big clinical safety standards which we went and looked at was something called DCB 0129, which, as far as we know, is the biggest, the most advanced clinical safety standard right now available, which is being used by the NHS. I don't think an equivalent standard exists anywhere else, and which almost became a starting point for us to even engage with a public health system. And there, essentially, what we had to demonstrate was, in the design process as well as in the architecture process, in the underlying technology architecture as well in the design and operational process, we had to demonstrate that we understood what the clinical risk was, even though the user stayed anonymous, and we were able to isolate and tabulate what that risk was, and then we had to create a mitigation plan and demonstrate that the mitigation plan was in operation. And that entire so it was almost starting with clinical safety embedded inside the product design and inside the product architecture, and from that point onwards, how it started playing out in operational processes. And I think that was the cornerstone of us going out and creating reassurance or assurance in terms of a enterprise buyer or an enterprise partner to look at a solution like Wysa and deploying it with a patient population. And here, the way the product is structured, I think that I'll end with two examples on how a clinical risk standard, or confining or aligning to a clinical risk standard, how it can play out in two different ways. One was what we calling inadvertent PII, where when the person is using the chat platform and they start talking, right now they don't do any kind of authentication, but during the course of the conversation, they may start talking about the place they're from, or the name of their spouse, or the school they went to. And the moment, and before you know it, you start capturing data which can be considered personally identifiable. And what we did was we created AI models which could recognize when PII was being shared, and before the chat transcripts or data were being stored at our end, we were redacting them. So you redact, and so we had to create a model, and this happened, in fact, the moment we started engaging with insurance companies. They obviously had very, very strict standards on how you would collect and manage PII, and they came up with this kind of risk. So what we had to do was construct the AI model which could recognize it, and then construct an operational process which would detect this before it is stored in our systems. And I think that is the second example is around understanding upfront what kind of clinical hazards which occur here. And for instance, one of the big issues which we face is people when they come in and start talking about mental health, they will talk about issues which are very, very intimate, but there are also some people who might be in crisis and who might start talking about suicidal ideation. They might start talking about self-harm. And how do you recognize them, and how do you then handle this process? So what we had to demonstrate was take that the protocol which we invoke in understanding first the AI models which we use to understand when people are talking about SOS or self-harm, and the second is the protocol which we use to escalate the person out of the application into um, globally recognized distress helplines, and how we record when that happens. So we maintain hazard logs, and those hazard logs are then shared with our own clinical safety officer, and then they're also presented to the board every quarter. And that entire process which we had to create and demonstrate to the people who were evaluating Wysa as a solution was extremely important. And I think so here, the evolution of our thought process starting from saying we are not going down that path of taking any PII at all the moment when you start with B2C users, and over time creating enough documentation and I think process maturity to start demonstrating to insurers and public health agencies, saying that now you understand what the clinical risk is, and then you have protocols in place which can actually help you manage that clinical risk, is extremely important. So I think I just end here with these two, and apologies for the issues on the tech side.
Thank you, Ramakanth, for bringing out some of the very important issues. Specifically, this is a different dimension in which we look at the data consent mechanism. Thank you very much for highlighting these points, and I'm sure this is also going to be very valuable input for programs like the NDHM. Now we come to the legal aspect. Rahul, we'd like you to talk about the legal aspects of data sharing, specifically, policies that may have to quickly adapt themselves to situations like the one that we are witnessing during COVID. Can we have a rigid policy or a dynamically configurable policy? That's something that we would like to hear from you in specific, and of course, the other legal aspects of data consent mechanisms. Rahul.
Thank you, Professor Kamakoti, and thank you all for inviting me. This is the second time I'm speaking at RAISE, so thoroughly delighted to have the opportunity to be part of this august panel. Very interesting, to come after all these speakers, because each time someone spoke, I had to revise the notes that I had prepared, and so I've got a complete mishmash of things. This is not a prepared speech. This is very much reactive. So just to first, I will, Professor Kamakoti, get to the dynamic versus static, because I think that's a very fundamental cornerstone of trying to figure out how to deal with tech policy. But it's probably interesting to get some sort of historical perspective, because we don't have a privacy law, but the concept of privacy and the concept of consent has been around since the late 70s, early 80s. And so it all originated with the Fair Information Practices Act, or Fair Information Practices Rules. It's called FIPS. That was then codified into the OECD guidelines on data protection. It was reflected into the 1984 Database Directive in the EU. And in those principles is where sort of data protection and privacy as we know it was formed. And so, Professor Kamakoti, those regulations were very principle-based. And so many of those principles actually remain in the law today. And so most of privacy is actually principles-based. And I think that's the beauty of it, because even before we got into this big data moment, some smart soul had figured out that this area is going to evolve so rapidly that if we come up with rigid rules, we're not going to be able to deal with something that comes up in 6 months from from now. Of course, in those days, it may have been 2 years from now, but now it's probably every 6 weeks. We're going to have to change it. So if you have rigid rules, you're not going to be able to survive. And so privacy is very much defined in the context of principles. And then if you think about GDPR, if you think about the California law, if you think about even our PDP bill, at the heart of it is principles, the privacy principles. And there are, you can divide them into many ways. There are principles, there are rights. But I'm going to pick up, 3 or 4 principles because they address some of the things that Kris said in his opening keynote, some of the things that Sidharth said. And I think I'm going to take that conversation just to one additional level. And so when you think about consent, the concept of consent is in the context of the privacy principles. So you need to consent to the purpose for which data is used. And that's the first principle, which is purpose limitation. You can't just say, I want to collect your data and use it for anything that I think of. You have to stipulate the purpose and you have to limit the purpose. The second thing is, after stating the purpose, you also have to limit it to using it only for that purpose. Because you may very nicely state that I want to collect it for purpose A. Then once you've collected it, you can use it for purpose X, Y, and Z. And that is not permitted. So there's a second principle, which is use limitation. The third principle that I'll talk about, and as I said, these are only some of the principles that we'll talk to, is data minimization. And the concept of data minimization is you collect only as much data as you need. Don't collect any more data. You've got issues even today. People say there is overcollection that is going on. So we may have clearly stipulated the purpose. We may have said the use, but there's clear overcollection going on. And so data minimization is a principle. All of this is stitched up and tied together with a bow by the process of notice and consent. And so notice and consent essentially is, I will give you notice that this is the purpose and that this is the use that I will put it to. And I will give you notice that this is the data minimization principle that I have, which is, Professor Kamakoti will know that in the Arogya Setu context, we actually minimize the data we were collecting to what was required. People still felt that we collected too much information. But I think, in the privacy policy itself, we said this is why we are collecting it and this is the minimum that we require. So once you've agreed to all of once you've seen all of these in the notice, you then consent to it. And then by consenting, what the framework says is you are aware of what we're going to use the information for. And so when you consent, that consent in a sense allows us to use it for these purposes. Plus it gives you the agency. It allows you to say, look, if a particular person is collecting it for a purpose I don't like, I won't engage with that person. Just to speak to the 2 medical examples before this, any one of those, people have the choice to participate. Of course, if it's a life and death situation, you don't. If it's, as we mentioned, COVID situation, sometimes it's very challenging. But generally speaking, the purpose of consent is that you don't always have to give it. And if you can exercise that choice, that then protects privacy. But there are many challenges with consent. And Kris, in his comment right in the beginning, actually highlighted a lot of them. In the world we're in today, the amount of data that is collected from us is staggering. Just if you think about, the IoT devices that are surrounding you, you're talking on, either a computer or a smartphone. That smartphone is collecting so much information about you that it's impossible to even figure out how much. If you're wearing a smartwatch today, that smartwatch, I have a watch that I've been wearing for 5 years. So for 5 years, every minute it collected my heart rate. And someone somewhere has got a perfect longitudinal record of exactly, how slow my heart goes when I sleep, how fast it goes when I run. There's a vast amount of information that's being collected. And even though we have consented to it, we don't fully understand what the consequences of that consent are. And the challenge with this is, because it is impossible to collect consent all the time, everyone collects it upfront. And when you collect consent upfront, and I know that Ramakanth and Geetha just spoke about the challenges they had to try and figure out consent, but there's no easy way to keep collecting consent every time from the patient. You usually say, when you sign up to the mental health app, you will give me a consent for doing ABC. And when I sign up, maybe I said, okay, but a year down the line, if I was asked that same question, I may not have consented, but there's no easy mechanism to deal with that. So for all of these reasons, and you know, if you think about it, if data is to be transferred from one entity to another, ideally, I would like to know who the entity it is that is being transferred to. But if you collect consent upfront, there is no way you can list that. You can only say that I will transfer it to entities that you know, if there's a, as Ramakanth was saying, if there's a sort of a risk to self-harm, then maybe you will transfer it to some practitioner who's an expert at dealing with this. And you may have consented to that. But at a later point in time, you know, I may not agree that that is okay, but consent has been taken upfront. So for all of these reasons, I think, you know, Kris mentioned that consent seems to be fundamentally broken. I wrote a paper in 2017, I'll come back to that later, where I actually said that very explicitly. I said, you know, we are using a mechanism to protect our privacy that was invented in the 1980s that absolutely did not conceptualize the big data world that we're in, and therefore I believe consent is fundamentally broken. So why have I been invited to this panel if I'm going to say that the very premise of this panel is flawed? Because I have a solution, and that solution in part refers to something that Sid mentioned in his remarks, and that is digital consent. Now, digital consent is if digital consent is just digitizing consent, then I don't think that is going to solve our problem. But in India, what we have done to digitize consent and in the digital consent framework is something very unusual. What we did was we unbundled consent. And when we unbundled consent, what we did, you know, in the first instance was we created a framework where there is a third party that will actually intermediate the consent. And in the financial sector, what we have got is an account aggregator, which will say that this data can be transferred from a bank to a lender in order to evaluate whether the borrower is someone who is worthy of being given a loan. And when it is transferred in this manner, we are securing the interests of the user because the entity that is transferring it is actually the individual. No other country in the world has thought of this. And so to start with, the consent frameworks that we are thinking about in India are radically different from the consent frameworks anywhere else in the world because we have managed to unbundle the consent layer from the data transfer layer. So the person who's transferring the data is different from the person who's transferring the consent. This is a fundamentally privacy preserving mechanism. And the second very important and interesting evolution that we have done with consent in India is something that didn't occur to me. In fact, when Sid first presented this DAPA framework to me, I said, why are we coming up with a new framework of consent? Because DAPA, I think, was introduced in about 2017, 2018. And 2017, I'd written this great paper saying that consent is broken and we shouldn't use consent anymore. What I understand now, after having watched the evolution of this through the financial services sector and into the medical sector, is that we've done a second unbundling. And that is we have unbundled consent from collection to sharing, or what I call consent to collect and consent to port. And I'm going to just apply this to both Ramakanth and Geetha, just to explain how this would potentially work in the context that they have provided. See, our challenge, as I said, is that if we have to transfer data to someone else, and in the medical field, you're constantly transferring data to all sorts of people, or data is being transferred to you. Medical tests are being done by somewhere else and it's coming to you. You are providing a diagnosis that is going for a second opinion. Now, you don't know, as I said, who that entity is to whom you are transferring it. And it is suboptimal to collect the consent to say, I will transfer it to anyone in the future that I think is okay, and that you could consent to allowing me to transfer it. If we can unbundle consent to collection consent and consent to port, the fundamental thing that we do is, in the beginning, we only ask for permission to collect the information. When we need to transfer it, we say we want the permission to transfer it, or in the words of the PDP bill, port the data. Now, if we can unbundle this, it makes it very powerful because the user has control even to the last moment when that control is actually required. But we can't do this without a framework. And that is the reason why DAPA is so powerful. DAPA has created a framework by which, having unbundled consent, first from the data layer, then from collection, we have an easy electronic mechanism to transfer the data to someone else. If we can implement data as we are in the healthcare sector, we can implement it in any other sector. And I'm sure Varad will talk about some of the work that he's doing to actually unbundle these sorts of principles across a wider environment. But when we can do this, we fundamentally change a lot of the things that are broken with consent. But let me just go back before I conclude to those principles again in the context of AI. Purpose limitation and use limitation are wonderful principles because it gives you agency. But in the context of artificial intelligence and building up data sets, these are terribly limiting. Because you know that you build better models of AI when you have larger data sets. And if you collect data for a particular purpose and say they can only be used for this particular purpose, you know that AI finds uses for data that you never conceptualized when you first collected the data. And that's the wonderful thing about data. So the concept of purpose limitation and use limitation is fundamentally opposed to the wonders that we can unlock with AI. Similarly, the concept of data minimization that I spoke about, which is fundamental to privacy since FIPS, OECD, the Database Directive, GDPR, and the PDP bill, is fundamentally inimical with the concept of artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence actually wants vast amount of data sets to be able to use. And I think some of the things that Kris said in the beginning, that Geetha said afterwards, which is about anonymization, certainly helps. Because if you anonymize this information, you're stripping out the personal data, which means that you're actually taking it out of the framework of the privacy law. And so, yes, you can work with it. But I would like to consider just those sorts of principles, and I would urge Kris and the committee, the NPD committee, to consider those sorts of principles as they roll out the framework under the non-personal data regime. Kris actually mentioned something which I found really interesting, which is he said that we need to move away from a consent framework. And he articulated a framework around transparency and checks and balances. And I found that really interesting because it's not that different from the framework that I articulated in 2017, which is an accountability framework. But I think what we should do, and I would urge Kris to think about actually adding on to his framework of transparency and checks and balances, the concept of accountability. Because what transparency and checks and balances does is it allows the data collector to become more visible. The data that's collected, the data practices that the data controller uses, the data fiduciary uses, becomes more visible. But I would like them to be responsible, which is make them accountable. And what this translates to is, because this doesn't work on its own, you've got to then come up with this principle of harms. And the principle of harms is a very old principle in equity and in law. It essentially, so if we can show that the data fiduciary, by doing what they did with the data, resulted in some harm to a user, we must hold them accountable. What can the harms be? The harms can be financial harm, it can be reputational harm. There are a whole set of harms. And if we can make them, so how I came to this principle was because of the very data asymmetry that Kris has talked about in his NPD report. That is that today we give up our data, and our data is just a little bit of data, but the data collectors who have the data have vast amounts of data. And so when we give the next set of data to them, we're giving it innocently. But because they already have so much other data, they're the ones who have the ability to understand what they can do with the data to us. So that the ability to decide whether the giving up of data will harm me or not actually is not with me. And still we try and solve it by consent, which is the consent that I give. Instead, we should solve this by saying, if you are collecting my data, maybe I've given you consent, but if you cause me harm, you must be accountable for it. And so what I would urge the NPD committee to do is actually to think to add this accountability. I think you're almost there. Transparency, checks and balances gives you the framework, and then you can add accountability, which will actually add this layer to make the harms also to come within the framework. I think many companies that are listening to this will be like, you're going to ruin our business. But quite frankly, today you're already accountable. You're accountable in the court of public opinion. I think, you may not have a law, but no one can have a data scandal. You cannot have a situation where it comes out in the public that you have harmed people because of the irresponsible way in which you dealt with data. You already have it. I mean, if you think you're going to hide behind this under the consent, saying that you've given me consent, so it's okay, it won't work. So why not articulate this in a framework that we can actually then say, look, if you did all of these things, okay, even though this happened, this is an innocent mistake. If you have followed all of these principles, yes, you will be accountable, but whatever the harm is mitigated because it was innocent. And that is the sort of framework that I think that we can talk about. So, Professor Kamakoti, I will wind up my remarks here just to say, I think Geetha wants to come back at me, but let me just say, this is a radical framework. Everyone I have presented this to, starting from Justice Sri Krishna, has said we don't even have a law right now. Please don't jump before we can learn how to crawl. But hopefully, if we can get to that point, we're going to make a jump. We are leapfrog nation. We've always leapfrogged from landline communications all the way to mobile. We should leapfrog beyond consent into this new paradigm.
We'll come to the questions later, Dr. Geetha. I think a lot of questions are there, and we can certainly take it up. I'll thank you, Rahul, for this. Wonderful. You've covered almost many topics here, and specifically from the legal framework. And legal is very, very important, as we realize in many of our programs across. Now I just move to Varad, voice of consumers. Right? What is your view on that? And what does the consumer want, and what does he doesn't want, right? So,
yeah, thank you, Professor. And firstly, just thank you and congratulations to my friend Abhishek Singh and his team for putting RAISE 2020 together. I think you raised the bar on RAISE and turned the crisis into opportunity this year by making this such a successful virtual event. So congratulations. So I'm Varad Pande. I'm a partner at Omidyar Network India. We are an investment firm focused squarely on social impact. Our investment philosophy is really around tech for good. We call it tech for good tech, har zindagi behtar. And therefore the issues of the data economy, especially as it relates to what we call the next $500 million, are very central to our work. So thank you for inviting me for this. And I think I'm the last speaker in this panel. So as the last speaker, it's an advantage and disadvantage. Advantage is you can say everything that needed to be said has been said. The disadvantage is you have to think of what is it that you can say which has not been said. So I'll do two things. One is, I think, just it may seem a little bit like a summary of some of the things you heard, but more importantly, I think I wanted to bring the angle of the sort of voice of the consumer, so to speak, a little bit. And I'll try to share my screen, and please let me know if this shows up. Professor, does this show up in your screen? Does my presentation?
It does show up. Just you can go. Yeah.
Great. So I've titled this "Does Consent Work? Bringing the Voice of the Indian consumer," based on some work I've done, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years. And very quickly speaking, I think this is a little bit of a synthesis of what you've been hearing. I think there are 4 key messages. The first, I think, is consent looks simple, but is actually quite complex. I think there's been some discussion here about consent being broken, I think, and I'll present some evidence to make the case. The third discussion is, can consent be fixed if it's broken? I think the answer is a maybe, and I'll again share some evidence on what could be some directions in which we can go, again, based on consumer research. And lastly, I think, and this leans heavily on what Rahul was last saying, which is going beyond consent is actually quite important. Even if we can fix parts of consent, I think it may be necessary, but not sufficient in what we seek to achieve over the next few decades for our country. So let me dive into it. I think the first one is fairly straightforward, and it's been talked about, so I won't dwell into it. But really, I think the point I wanted to make here was the way consent has evolved. It does seem like a sort of a legalistic or a compliance orientation kind of an approach. And if you think about, what does it actually take to achieve consent, it's actually fairly complex. And I think Kris talked about it, Sidharth talked about it, so I won't go into these characteristics, but essentially these are very important words, freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous, revocable, etc. But actually quite hard to achieve if you want to achieve these, right? And most importantly, I think in designing these, this is sort of a wish list approach. So the voice of the consumer and what is practical here is somewhat missing. And I think that is what we need to bring much more centrally into this discussion. So what is it that we have learned, I think, in terms of consent being broken? So I'll cite two studies to you, which, been personally involved with. One is a study we did in late 2017 at this combination of organizations, Dalberg, CGAP, which is a global organization under World Bank, and Dwara, which was really a human-centered ethnographic study in 4 different parts of India to really understand. These were not, the elite Indian, but really tried to think of the next 500 million Indians who are new to using digital, new to the digital economy in some way, and trying to understand what does data consent mean in their context through ethnographic study. I think the takeaway really was that, unlike what is sometimes caricatured, people subliminally care about privacy quite a bit. They do sign off to things quite easily, but they remain quite anxious about what they are signing off to, and so on. And I think even beyond consent, I think people seek control in terms of at least sort of figuring out trade-offs, which they currently feel they don't get because of the all or nothing nature of consent that we largely have today. The second study was done by the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy last year, which was a very interesting, simple experiment, which was they did a quiz to test how well urban English-speaking college-going students understand the privacy policies of 5 popular apps: Flipkart, Google, Paytm, Uber, WhatsApp. Practically all of these we all use, right? And then they give them a quiz based on a globally recognized comprehension test. And what they found was even these, English-speaking college-going students scored on an average of 5.3 out of 10 in understanding the privacy policy when they were told that they should be reading it. The level of complexity of these policies was assessed to be at the level of a Harvard Law Review paper. So that was, I think, sort of giving a sense of the challenge we have when we say consent and making consent understandable. And of course, as other speakers have alluded to, this is exacerbated by the fact that, we are grappling with issues of language and digital literacy, and almost all consent notices in India today are in English. So this is really, I think, a sort of an important problem to solve, and it is actually quite broken, I think is the point worth emphasizing here. So what can be done about this, right? So can consent be fixed? And like all complex questions, I think the answer here is maybe. But here are some possibilities, again, coming out of some recent work which has been taking place. I think one very long recognized thing is this idea of changing the default option. There's a lot of global literature on this, but really in the context of consent, can we give people real choices versus more the, the accept all kind of an approach that today seems to exist? The default option changes behaviors drastically. What is the first thing that you're told to accept or choose versus changing something? So that is, I think, a well-known thing, and we should think about how we can bring this in much more centrally. The second is very interesting. So a recent piece of work by the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University. They did this survey to, they gave these privacy messages. And what they did was they did what is called norming, which is they primed user with a message to read the privacy policy by saying something like, this will only take you 2 minutes. It's the same as, brushing your teeth. So, it's really worth it. Please do it. So this is norming, right? And they found this has some influence in people spending a little more time, not very much more, but a little more time in reading the privacy policy before offering their consent. The third is actually the most interesting one, which is again from the same CSBC study, what the idea of a forced cool down period, which basically meant that they took the user to a consent page and they forced the user to stay on the consent page for 5 minutes. This seemed to work quite well. The user was sort of forced to engage in some way with the privacy policy. And I think one interesting thing that came out was this kind of thing helped build trust helped in the willingness to share more information than they would otherwise, at least subliminally want to share. And so I think this idea of can we focus people's attention to what matters through either norming or through forced nudges, such as cool down periods, could be one very interesting, citizen-centric, user-centric approach to tackling the consent issue. The fourth, I think, is the sort of the rules of thumb idea, which again, a version of an experiment they did in the same study, which is, the star rating system type of approach. In India, we have a great example of this with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which has the star ratings for everything from air conditioners to refrigerators, which has worked, I think, fairly well. But that kind of rule of thumb, messages that people can very quickly relate to in terms of what is the level of quality of the privacy policy can help make people make more sensible, informed, truly informed decisions compared to what they're being asked to make today. And lastly, I think this is from the Dalberg Dwara CGAP work, which was something that was tested there, which is the whole notion of can we adopt non-textual approaches? And there we experimented with sort of video where somebody sort of explains you the consent, or a pictorial consent where there's almost like a infographic which makes it much easier to understand what you're signing up to. It helps clarify and build confidence quite clearly. So I think the difficult question, but I think we have some possibilities. If you want to take a citizen first, consumer first lens, I think here are some areas we need to work on and adopt if we really want consent to work in the context of the Indian consumer. I think, and so that's on the consent piece. But I think, to Rahul's point and others as well, I think consent alone will never be good enough, even if we were to do all of these things and many other things that we might have. And so I think we should think of consent as sort of a necessary but not sufficient, as economists would say, in this data privacy discussion. And just some thoughts, and I think, again, what would it take to go beyond consent? And here I'm borrowing a lot from folks who have done some thinking on this. So I think the first sort of important thing is recognizing that the consumer is the owner of the data, right? And I think one of the big paradigm shifts India has done, thanks to Justice Sri Krishna's draft of the privacy bill, was to call Indians the data principal and not the data subject. And he made a very interesting point around the fact that I stopped being a subject when the British left India, so why should anybody in India be called a data subject? So I think the idea that the citizen is a data principal, he or she has clear rights around confirmation, correction, erasure, transfer. And secondly, I think imposing some amount of obligations links to the accountability point mentioned earlier, some amount of obligations on the data collector to act in the best interest of consumer. Commitments on purpose and collection storage limitation, more measures, I think, on transparency, especially around grievance redress, which I think is quite broken in many ways in our country. And then for significant data fiduciaries, based on some criteria, additional measures such as data protection impact assessments. Now, the good news here is I think a lot of this is there in the PDP bill, which is in Parliament. So I think we really do have an opportunity to, in some way, leapfrog the work on this in a global context. And a third idea, which I know, Rahul, you and others have been arguing for, which I think is also worth mentioning in this context, which is, can we create a sort of a set of folks who are actually going to be the custodians of the consumer interest? So something like, in the legal language, you could call it learned intermediaries, but, these could be like qualified consumer advisors, essentially, who actually can stand in the shoes of the consumer, and not dissimilar to what doctors sometimes do when they advise patients on, which medicine to take and what the risks might be of taking different medicines when they have a choice of treatment. So warning consumers about dangerous data practices, educating public about complex notices, industry practices. I think it's a good idea and it requires a little bit of cooking. But I think here's another sort of a concrete way in which we can take the discussion beyond consent. So I think that's what I wanted to say. I think consent is important. I think there's a lot of evidence that today consent is broken. Consumers are saying that in different types of studies that we have seen. I think there are some promising ideas on how consent can be fixed, norming, changing default options, cool down periods and nudges and using pictorial and video consent and so on, which should all be experimented with, but we have a long way to go. And then I think we should not rely on consent to be the silver bullet. We need to do things which go beyond consent. There are a whole range of ideas in the PDP bill, but even beyond that, we need to be creative to sort of think about this agenda. So I'll just pause there and hand it back to you, to the chair.
Thanks a lot, Varad. I think it has opened up a lot more of interesting points and interesting way by which we can proceed and make a leapfrog in giving a very great digital economy for the country. I think there are a lot of questions that have come up, and we will take up some 6 to 8 questions. We have another 20 minutes before we need to close the session. So the first question, I'd like to go with Dr. Geetha, who actually put out a point on something like the post-market surveillance, the need for necessity for collecting data. For example, let us take this current scenario of we do a vaccination for COVID, and we need to have a post-vaccination surveillance in some sense, because we need to monitor the progress of the antibodies that need to be developed, and whether it is developing properly, and if suppose some batch has an issue, whom should you go and redo the thing, or attend to them. So Rahul, this question is for you, right? So what do you think? What sort of consent we need to get in the event of us vaccinating somebody for corona, and we should tell them that we will be doing some surveillance on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I understand, and I'm not a doctor. I feel reluctant to speak in the presence of people who know more than me. But let's just say what I've read is that you will, for the vaccine, you will need to get 1 dose and 1 booster dose, right? There is at least some minimal surveillance that we will need to identify people who have got the dose and who don't have the dose. People who need to have the second dose, there is a certain amount of tracking that we will need to do. That's at the first level. Second level is, this is a vaccine that we're going to be rolling out completely cold. This is not a vaccine that has been around for a long time. As much as we may test it, we've got to be able to know that if we've given a dose, a particular batch of vaccine has resulted in some harm somewhere in the rural hinterland, we've got to get that information back to be able to tell all the other people who are part of that batch of the vaccine that there's potentially a problem with this particular batch. I'm just sort of taking extreme scenarios. Now, in those scenarios, there is a public health criteria that I think we can invoke. And if you look at the PDP bill actually makes exceptions for these sorts of things. And in a very prescient kind of way, Justice Sri Krishna actually refers to an epidemic in the PDP bill. Obviously, he drafted this before the epidemic. But this is just to say that, I think while we're talking about consent, we've got to think of exceptions for consent as well. We can't take exceptions for consent in all circumstances, but certainly exceptions for consent in the context of an emergency. And if we've got a global pandemic where you do need to collect some information, it is well recognized around the world that there should be an exception for consent. I think the only caveat would be that once that emergency situation has passed, we must certainly revert back to normal. And we cannot use the emergency situation as an opportunity to get rid of consent in this context forever. Because very often we tend to revert to that. We've got to always, the moment the emergency is gone, revert back to the normal state where we will operate in a more normal manner.
Sure. I think Kris has a question. Yes, sir.
No, and I just want to add to what Rahul said. See, this is a situation where the state acts in the best interest of the people. And we need to create a consent mechanism in such cases, which is typically done through the judiciary. We go to a special court, get the permission to, deploy surveillance in these cases, and get it through either the judiciary or through an act in the legislature or something like that. And so that process must also be defined in order to do this under certain circumstances for a limited period of time. Actually, this is broader than that because every street corner now has a camera, video camera, and you're being surveyed. The surveillance is happening actually continuously, and it's also happening through private. Any establishment you go, any car now you get into, there's a camera that's actually videotaping you, and all that is being done today with very, I think, insufficient legal framework around these things. At some point, this will all go to courts where, that there will be discussion whether it's allowed, not allowed, permission, not permitted, all those questions. And it is important for us to broaden our discussion to include all kinds of data capture that happens without us knowing or unknowingly.
May I make a comment, Professor?
Yes, please. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
so thank you very much, Kris. And also,
just sorry, you can also add what is this ISO 13485 for the
yeah. So that was not a question to Mr. Rahul. I was like very energized by the new ideas that Rahul mentioned for the new proposed framework for data sharing, especially with the private, and also what Sir Kris mentioned as well. So I was just trying to provide an analogy to a framework that exists in a highly regulated system such as medical devices, right? Where one of the regulatory standards is ISO 13485, which is basically allows you a medical device. If you are conforming to ISO 13485, your company, your healthcare company, is now following proper QMS standards, which mean the quality management standards, so that whatever medical device that is produced or launched by the company is adhering to many of the privacy practices that were articulated by both Kris and Rahul and others, right? So I guess, so that kind of, relation is something that I had not very much internalized before, but during this discussion is something that's coming out. So, but what we are saying then is, if it is anonymized data, of course, there are a set of laws we can follow. But if it is, let's say, private, there is personally identifiable information, probably the framework that we will have will be very much aligned to what a medical device company needs to adhere to, because it is whatever guidance we give is very much going to probably affect the person, like looking at adverse effects, looking at post-market surveillance. These are specific processes that are already defined in ISO 13485 and the CE mark. You would have heard about the European CE mark. All of these go through all of these process structure that is there. But maybe it's high time to adapt and adopt those processes to highly, or make it highly regulated for PII-oriented, data analysis. So that analogy is what I thought I'll bring to the discussion, because these are very, very interesting ideas that Kris and Rahul have mentioned. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
So,
Professor Kamakoti, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
There is thank you, Dr. Geetha, and there is a question from Chetan Joshi. Judicial orders are on web, and that has the party names, the respondents and defendants, etc. What is the take on that? Is it a violation of some privacy, or we have everything on that, right? So Rahul, I think it's for you.
Because it's judicial. So look, I mean, I think I guess the point is that just the name is rarely thought to be a privacy violation. Just having your name, I mean, your name certainly in the case is going to be associated with whatever the case is about. And as you know, it is possible for the courts to actually say these are in-camera proceedings. So typically, all proceedings take place in a public courtroom. Anyone can walk into the courtroom, anyone can hear what you're saying. So to that extent, certainly it is fundamentally non-private. I think the complication which the person who asked the question is raising, which is a very interesting one, is that in this current age where, previously it is limited to all the people who are in the court, right now, anything is available to everyone on the internet, and that is sort of millions and maybe billions of people. So what do we do in that context? Now, I just want to sort of expand on that to say that, say in a family dispute, it is possible for the court to say that this is an in-camera proceeding, which means they will clear the court. And so only the parties, because there is sensitive information going on, will be in the court, and the lawyers of the parties. It is possible to come up with those sorts of provisions even in the reporting of cases. And in fact, all judges will say, after the decision is articulated, will say, this case is for reporting, or this case is not for reporting. Now, the fact that they've said it's for reporting or not is not really a criteria anymore, because today all the courts actually publish, the Supreme Court publishes all its cases out on the Supreme Court portal. But the point I'm trying to make is that where there is personal information, it is possible to actually limit it. And where there isn't, usually just the articulation of someone's name is not enough to identify that as personally identifiable information that is entitled to the protection under the PDP bill.
Sure.
Professor, can I just add something to what Rahul said? Yeah.
Yes,
So,
Varad.
yeah, I think the questioner has also raised a very important broader point, which is that, there is on the one hand a whole movement around open data and, all of that good stuff from a transparency perspective. And then we also have these concerns from a data privacy perspective. And at some point, one will have to make choices and trade-offs and rules around it, right? When I was in the Ministry of Rural Development, we were very proud that on the Mahatma Gandhi Narega, the entire list down to the village level of job cards, etc., is on the ministry website, right? Similarly, when the socio-economic caste census was done in 2011, the entire list of things were put in the gram panchayat as a means of transparency, that everybody can see whether their data has been recorded correctly, but everybody could also see everybody else's data in the same list. So on the one hand, there's this whole global movement that, from an issue of greater transparency and governance, we need to provide as much data as possible to the public. On the other hand, we also want to we need to find ways, and I think the rules around what data is available at what levels of aggregation will be very important part of the answer. But I'm also curious to know what Kris and Abhishek have to say on this, because I'm sure you've grappled with it too.
So, let me give a perspective here. See, the first example, when it comes to judiciary, it's based on precedents and the judgments that have happened before, and that's the reason why it's always public. It used to come in books and things like that. But now, because we have gone digital, it's all online searchable, and you can quickly find something. But the reason behind that is precedence based, and you can quote a particular judgment for a future this thing. Now, what Varad talked about, I think we need to, as government, decide what will we disclose and what we will not disclose, because the consequences of these are significant. And unfortunately, we have actually never discussed the consequences of something being public, and government needs to clearly articulate what will be in public domain and what will not be in public domain. And this is something which, from a corporate, from a governance perspective, I think government needs to actually articulate very clearly, and as part of the PDP bill or the NPD bill, etc., we'll have to articulate, and it can have significant harm if there's lots of data that is public actually, and it's rather unfortunate today.
So there are many questions. So in the interest of the audience, we are extending the session by 15 minutes. I hope all of you don't mind, because there are very, very interesting questions that are coming up. So the next question is, I think, best for Gopalakrishnan sir. Sir, the question is, any data collected within a car, who is the owner of the data? Is it the car owner or the manufacturer? And specifically, if it is an imported car, what is the take? Right.
In our discussion, we came to the conclusion that since the car is owned by an entity, it's private space, and it's it's owned by the person who owns that car. Once that contractually the ownership is transferred to that individual, then whatever data comes out of that is part of the individual's data. That's the conclusion that we have come to. I'm open to hearing any other argument around this.
Yes. Sidharth, if you have a comment on that. Rahul, anyone, please. Your car data is collected. Who you own it, or the car manufacturer?
Yeah, I think it's definitely nuanced because, and there are two parts to this. I think one can take a ownership perspective, or one can sidestep this and actually take a rights-based perspective, essentially saying data many a times is co-created with the platforms. In this case, the various sensor systems that are part of the car, along with, of course, the driver and the owner of the car. And in which case, both parties should have legitimate rights over access to this information. In the case of the sensor companies using this to build autonomous car models, and in the case of the individuals, maybe using that data to get better insurance packages under the right ethical framework. So, one view is an ownership perspective. One view is possibly looking at it also from a rights-based way when you have multiple parties involved in that transaction.
Sidharth, see, here you have to give consent for the manufacturer to collect that data. So it's still the individual, and the individual gives the consent for the owner to continue. It's very similar to the example I shared in the first screen, where the manufacturer is asking me permission, can my data be shared with them for them to improve their service? So I have to give specific permission for doing that.
Kris, can I just challenge that by just expanding the scenario a little bit?
Sure.
Because in the future, we're going to have connected cars and we're going to have smart cities. So there is data that will be collected out of, for instance, the traffic management system. So let's say in an accident or in an insurance claim, there'll be a combination of data. There'll be the data in the car, which talks about the speed or the way the car is functioning. There will be the data in the cars around that will talk about how this particular car. So this is data that the cars around collect about my car. There will be data that the city collects out of its scanners, its speed scanners, its traffic lights, etc., etc. And so I like Sidharth's rights framing in that context. So in the context that you're mentioning, it's quite clear because I bought the car, I'm sitting inside the car, and so definitely there is a transactional element. But I would also like to have a right to the information in all these other environments so that I can then use that information in my context and to improve my claim, etc., etc.
Yeah, but this is, of course, to be discussed and debated. My initial response here is that, the principle, you talked about principle, right? The principle should really be, I don't share, I shouldn't be forced to share something that will harm me.
Correct.
Right? So in that sense, if you use that as a principle, even if somebody else is observing me without my permission, that data cannot be used against me. Right? So I'll just leave it there, but this needs further discussion. So that's the principle I would use.
But what happens if it is anonymized, sir? No,
anonymized, then the question of harm doesn't come. And anonymized, that's why we have specifically said, and the process of anonymization requires a specific consent so that you know that you're part of an anonymized database.
Yes.
And I'm also seeing an analogy between the car example and the healthcare example, saying that there is a generator of data and then there are data processors and consumers. And at least from a provider's perspective, we always take that that the fact that you take a position that the originator of the data is the person who is owning it. And from an ethical point of view, it seems most, I think, tractable. And even from a consumer trust point of view, that seems to be more. I'm taking a completely practical view of this, saying that as a provider of services, if I want to build trust in my own service, I think the most probably pragmatic way of doing it would be to reassure the consumer, saying that you're the owner of your data. So I'm not talking about the ethical, the legal framework behind it, but mainly from the point of view of saying, if I have a commercial objective or if I have a service objective and I need to build trust with the user, this is the way I would go.
And just to continue on that question now, this is for Sidharth, right? What would be the difference between the account aggregator that you have been talking of and the same thing for the health sector? So will the health data exchanges or health collaboration that we have, will it be very similar to an account aggregator, or there'll be some significant difference? right? Because that we lot of non-personal health data sets that could be of use to the to build better products. Now, if a patient is responsible for giving that data to for building up a product, so does he have a stake in the product, right? So, right,
Yeah.
so how do you distinguish this one? Yeah.
So I think there are two questions in that. One is related to personal data, and second is related to non-personal or anonymized information. From a personal data standpoint, which is where the data empowerment and protection architecture comes in, it will be essentially the same framework that's been applied in finance that will also apply for health information as well. From a technology point of view, from a institutional architecture point of view, from a market architecture point of view. But there are some nuances that come in the case of health as this framework gets deployed. So for example, one nuance in health information is around when you visit a doctor, does a doctor have a right to access all your health records at that point in time for that transaction, right? And now you can, there are two views that are available. One view is doctors subscribe to a do no harm principle, and hence they should legitimately access your health information because let's say it's a particular clinical case. If they know you have a particular mental health history, they may advise you a better treatment plan. However, on the same side, given the socio-cultural context in India, revealing of certain, even revealing the fact that you may have taken an HIV test, which is the title of that test report, could result in a lot of harms to that individual, right? And therefore, there is another view where the individual should have the right to anonymous health transactions. Now, from a technology standpoint, the architecture is agnostic of both of these implementations. And really, it's up to the legal framework to subsequently take a call on what would be the right approach given various input parameters, so to speak. So fundamentally, the same architecture as account aggregator would be applicable for health. But there are, like I said, nuances. This is one nuance. Second is the need for purpose-linked data sharing and templates becomes a lot more important in health transactions and so on. The nature of an informed consent becomes a lot more important because, and even the ones that are the individuals or entities that get access to your health information, unlike in finance, for example, if there is a particular lady, she's accessed her PHR health records, she has it on a mobile phone. In a past, she happened to have an abortion. And her husband suddenly decides to force her to actually reveal all of that health information, that can have serious complications. So therefore, there is, when you look at it from a nuanced perspective, one has to deeply think through the access control rights, and some of those take in a lot more importance in the context of health information versus the context of financial information. But fundamentally, it runs on the same rails. Then on the anonymized data side, I think health, as the legal and proposed framework that Kris has put together in the report, fundamentally, anonymized data has a lot more applications in health. Finance has, over a period of time, already built out these anonymized data models. So, one area where anonymized information is critical is in the case of underwriting, risk assessment. It's essentially a prediction of the probability of default of a borrower. And the financial sector has built out, credit bureaus that give access to this anonymized data. RBI is now working on the public credit registry, which would be much more real time in nature. And then, of course, banks themselves have, preserved historical copies of default histories of different borrower profiles, and therefore, it is far more mature. But in the case of health, where you have enormous fragmentation of providers, right, and provider systems, the need for a fairly simple legal and technology framework so that a range of the companies that are even on this call can easily partner and build out AI models becomes a lot more key, right? So we do see, one of the first areas where the non-personal data framework becomes very important would be in the health sector more so than the finance sector in that sense.
So thanks. That's a very detailed response. I think everything has a lot of say in the National Digital Health Mission, and I think it's going to be very valid at that in that context. Now we go into a slightly different type of question. So AI, now there's ethics of AI is becoming very big, right? So is it time that AI professional be regulated, like doctors are given license? Can we have AI people? They be licensed?
That's a great question. Actually, I was 2 years ago, I think I was presenting at this conference, Digital Intervention Mental Health in the UK, where exactly the same question came up. And the room was full of folks who were working in mental health across the world. And I think the consensus, it was almost a uniform consensus saying that we need a charter of rights for patients or for consumers of health services. I'm not talking specifically of mental health, but I think of health services in general, saying that it is almost a charter of rights which is given to the patient or to the consumer uh, as they start using, saying this is what you can expect and this is what you should expect. And this is not just a regulatory or a legal view, but it's also an ethical view on saying that that this is not just what is right from a legal point of view, but obviously is also right per se. And their issues around control of data, and I think a lot of those now have been probably captured in various different frameworks around, for example, GDPR or HIPAA, saying that the right to be forgotten, the right to have a say in how your data is being used. But somehow, I mean, I think on this panel, I'm kind of taking a consumer view or a patient view, saying that if you, and I think that's something which Varad made a really nice point, saying put the user at the center and give the agency to the user and ask them, saying, how would you like to be informed about how consent is taken, of how your data is used? And I think that should be the framework, or that is almost a backbone of creating an approach towards the ethics of AI, saying that what would make the patient comfortable or what would make the user comfortable with the way the data is being collected, transported, and used, and use that as a way of defining it. But short answer to that is yes, absolutely. I think there is probably a need
So,
to have a overarching framework of the
Professor
ethics.
Kamakoti, see, my thought here is that as the speed of change increases, that means we are doing things faster and faster, and we are innovating continuously. We need to have one ethics around the use of innovation and technology, and in healthcare, the ethics board is actually separate from the corporate board and things like that. There's a separate ethics board, etc. And so around AI innovation, some of these emerging technologies, we need to have an ethics framework. And then once we have figured out what that innovation really means, right? Then we need to have the legal framework in order to make sure that mass adoption happens. But what is unfortunate now is that mass adoption is simultaneously happening. So AI is now everywhere. If you just look at Siri or Echo or anything, behind that is all AI only, and it's all listening to you continuously. So there's an intermingling of not just AI, but all kinds of intrusive technologies without we even realizing it. And this is a difficult, that's why this is quite difficult actually. And the other challenge with some of these technologies is that the service providers are cross-border. So which rules and regulations are applicable to them? This also needs to be clearly articulated, and the stand that we have taken, and that's the reason why we were very emphatic on establishing our rights, that is India's rights, on the legal framework that is applicable to all services provided in India is Indian. Right? If you're going to provide a service in India, then the rules and regulations that you must follow is Indian, and we want to establish that very clearly.
Just want to add my perspective because it's AI and healthcare related. And thanks, Kris, for a wonderful suggestion here. So there are 2 points I want to make. One is Kris referred to ethics board, right? And we find that every time we start a valid clinical trial, I'm just taking you back to the clinical trial because that is the place where the AI-based medical device, which is making a clinical decision, helping a doctor, is being evaluated. The device is being evaluated. There we do have a separate, ethics board and how the ethics committee needs to be constituted with 15 different disciplines in the pure interest of whether it is going to harm the patient, right? Like Kris mentioned, it is an innovation. It will be evaluated by this DCGI-enabled ethics committee to say whether this device, even during the trial, is going to harm a person. After the trial, obviously, is another element. The second point I want to bring into this concept, that question that was asked, should AI-based devices be regulated like doctors? Means like, especially when AI-based devices such as Niramai's breast cancer screening is being released to the public, it is possible that doctor gets influenced by the results that, even though we say, okay, the results will be read by a doctor before, giving the report to the end user, the doctor can be influenced by the AI machine, right? So clearly, yes, the AI-based medical devices also need to be, regulated. And I'm sort of, shooting myself on my foot, but it is very important from an end consumer perspective. And the way in India it is today is that the classification of the AI software is same as the hardware that it is attached to, whether AI or not. The software gets the same classification. Class A, B, C, D is the classification that of the hardware. If the hardware is like, poking into the person and so on, in vivo and all that we talk about in vitro. So the similar thing comes to the software. However, if you look at the US FDA regulation, this is not the case. There are specific concrete proposals as to how an AI-based medical device need to be evaluated, need to be classified. That is very, very strict in the US FDA framework. And they also say how, for example, an AI model, all of you know that, they can learn with more and more data and more, label data comes in. So it's not like a doctor gets an MBBS, he gets a certificate. After that, the doctor learns more. Same way, AI also keeps learning, but there is a strict adherence and rules also that have been proposed. It's still not fully implemented to say how a new retrained AI model can be released as well. That is, you can't just say, the AI is learning, because it can learn wrong things as well. So what kind of testing, needs to be done? And all of this is very well articulated in the US FDA. And, it's glad to see that India is also trying to at least adopt the first ISO 13485. And some of these elements should eventually come into the medical devices that are being released for Indian citizens.
Abhishek and then Rahul.
Can I ask a question to Rahul and Sidharth? This is an important question about the separation of unbundling of consent between consent to collect and consent to share. Once the data is anonymized, how are you anymore going to get the consent to share or port?
Kris, this is a PDP framework. So it is a personal data framework.
No, anonymized data is derived from PDP.
So so the way I would articulate this in your construct, which is that according in the report, you said that you would inherit the consent of the entity from which this was derived. And that obviously, and you articulated three types of NPD. NPD derived from people, NPD derived from government, and NPD derived from the community. And obviously, the consent would largely apply to the NPD derived from people.
I know, but you can't get a consent at the time of sharing. That's all I wanted to highlight.
Yes, but you could get a consent at the time of anonymization.
That's why we have come up with explicit consent for anonymization, because you need to understand the implication of anonymization. This will be used now forever. This is not going to be deleted. You can't pull it back. You can't take it out anymore.
But I would actually say that, obviously, DEPA was not designed for this. DEPA was designed to transfer. But I'm sure we can come up with a mechanism. See, the thing that I would be concerned about.
Sorry. Yeah. The reason I say this is there may be a future technology or future way to triangulate this and de-anonymize this data.
Correct.
Right. So that's the difficulty when it is anonymized from personal data. It's still
capable of being re-identified.
Exactly. Exactly.
So let me just say what I'm concerned about. And what I'm concerned about is that if I join up to a service today and I give my consent to anonymize today, and it's actually anonymized 10 years later, the time of anonymization is so far from the time of consent that my consent is not meaningful anymore. So can we come up with a construct where, just like you get a consent just before you share, that you take consent, would you get a consent just before you're anonymized to anonymize? Now, the problem is that is actually, it'll be very cumbersome from the context of building these big AI models. Because, usually people, when you tell them, I'd like to anonymize your data for research purposes, everyone hates it. I mean, all the doctors will know that no one likes their data to be used as experimental data. So I think these are the challenges. This is a really difficult thing that you have taken up to do. You're not going to find easy answers, I'm afraid, on this.
If we explain to them why the data will be used, like I mentioned, in rural areas to treat people, they actually consent. And we write that we will be using your anonymized data, like Kris mentioned. We take the consent for anonymization.
So I'm only talking about the separation, unbundling the consent.
Yes.
To when the transaction really happens, and this transaction, now you can't go back to the data principle anymore.
3 more questions before we wind up. The other question, this I think I'm requesting Varad to answer this. Any consent given at a level that is beyond the user's degree of comprehension or awareness is meaningless. So different users will naturally have different degrees of comprehension and awareness and competence. Is there a way by which we test this before we take the consent? Like, you give Greek and Latin and they say yes or no, what does it mean? Right. So this is a question by one Kiran Varanasi.
Right. No, I think that's correct, right? I mean, all the research we've seen is that we are all at very different levels of our digital adoption journey and our, I think there are 2 points, right? One is that even for fairly quote unquote advanced users, as the NIPFP work showed, we are far away from a consent that people understand, right? And we're saying that even college going good graduate students are getting 5.3 on 10 and comprehension of privacy policies. Even for relatively more advanced, digitally advanced and linguistically advanced users, we have a long way to go, right? And then we are saying, of course, it's much harder for the new to the digital economy people, and for them we need also sort of different ways of making this comprehensible, and that's why I think pictorial, video, infographic, all of these approaches are important to take forward. So there's almost like a segmentation from that perspective. And then I think there are some more around the form issues rather than the substance issues, which is the ideas on norming and the ideas on forcing people to spend some time on something. Those I think are more cross-cutting things that will apply to both the segments that we spoke about. But in general, I think the responsibility of the state and of, especially when you're thinking from a legal framework, is really to ensure that the framework serves the most disadvantaged, right? So we need to create something that doesn't only suit the advanced user, but actually, the new to digital economy user, which is going to only grow, I think, in the next decade by, very, very substantial amounts.
Abhishek, you want to respond to this?
Yeah, in fact, I've been the discussion was so engaging that at several points of time, though as a host, I was supposed to not speak, but I was tempted to intervene because it was very engaging and so many aspects affect us every day when we do whatever we do in government. Always been a balance between ensuring transparency, ensuring provisions of right to information, as well as ensuring privacy and as well as ensuring data consent mechanisms. So like, for example, the question that was given with regard to giving the list of beneficiaries of a particular scheme in a village. So when we put that name and details, is it like, are we taking consent of the beneficiaries before we are putting that? So technically speaking, maybe not, but for the purposes of transparency, we do that. So always it's a balance between what is good, what is for the larger public good. So I would say that this same principle in some form would have to apply whether we are sharing data with regard to or for anonymized data for healthcare or research. So for example, if I have to share anonymized data for research purposes or for building a solution which might ultimately improve the lives of people, there it might be a fairer thing to do rather than sharing the same data with an insurance company for designing an insurance policy and working on the principles, the premiums. So I think there can be subjectivity there. So there are no right answers, I would say, but as long as we have principles of ethics around this, and we have ethics board which takes a call in these things, so that ultimately, because of a proper data consent mechanism, we should not stop innovation being taking place or building solutions which can be useful for the larger public good. And the same applies in the governance principles. I would think that can be a standard on which we can abide by and work on. And the regulator, which has been proposed in the non-personal data committee report, can be that body, can be that authority which can set up the principles and ensure that the principles are abided in letter and spirit. So I would feel that from the public point of view.
Abhishek ji, in the case of the direct benefits transfer, etc., see, what probably is needed is a audit mechanism or a mechanism to validate and reassure people rather than post it publicly, because the harm that causes by posting public is probably significantly higher. But you want to definitely reassure public that this has been spent properly and things like that, and that can be done through an audit mechanism, which will have to an independent audit mechanism which will actually reassure people, etc. So we have to find the appropriate solution. So if we understand the goal, then the appropriate mechanism can be created. So violating privacy must be only done as a last resort, is my that's the principle again, Rahul's point, right? Principles, right? So that should be the principle that we must use.
In fact, I agree with that largely, but what happens is that very often in a public service domain, whatever audit mechanisms we may have, there will be people who will be questioning that, and they will be saying that all this is fixed. Even people don't have trust in systems.
So sorry to interrupt you. I always say that we have the right to choose the government. So we need to, in some sense, trust the government. We cannot make laws, or we may not come up with principles by saying that, it doesn't work. Then it's our responsibility to make it work as a community, as a society, as people work. We have a role in what the government does. So see, again, I come back to, violating privacy must be the last resort rather than, so we need to all together come up with the right answers. I know this is ideal situation, but, I'm just saying that we should start from there and then look at how we can do these things.
Sure. The last question before we wind up, I'll just rephrase it. The 2 or 3 questions, I just made one question out of these 3 questions. So A has a visiting card and he gives it to B. B leaves it on top of his table. So somebody comes and photographs that information and use that mobile number, etc., to crack the password of A. Can A sue B for negligence?
This is a Rahul question.
I mean, so look, this would be, I guess, negligence or something like that, and we'll have to go back to basic tortious principles as opposed to privacy, because this is not a privacy violation. So I mean, there's no. If I've collected your card and I've left it around, I can only be
data to you. I'm given my data about me to you through the card, and what is the consent mechanism?
No, if you've given your data to me, then you have consented to me getting your data and using it. So I think the consent is implicit in the action of handing your card over. So from a consent perspective, I can use your data whichever way I want. Now I'm actually going one step further, which is the principle of I cannot transfer your data to someone else without your consent. Whereas I have left it around on the table and someone has collected it, and therefore effectively I have transferred it without your consent, which means that now I am guilty of this tort of negligence. Now, can I be sued under privacy law we'll need to look at, there are many privacy principles we didn't talk about. One of them is data security. So anyone who is collecting data has an obligation to keep it secure. And then to maintain the quality of the data, there are a number of principles we didn't have the time to get into. But I would just say that one of the good things about the Sri Krishna draft is that he has made an exception for personal processing. Sorry, manual processing. So essentially, if you are collecting business cards like this, let's say to organize a birthday party for your son and you want to speak to all the parents, that is a sort of a manual processing which there is a specific exemption for. But if on the other hand, you are a company who is in the business of collecting these business cards such that you can later spam people, then certainly there would be a violation. And so I like the analogy because it could also be used for this very simple thing that all of us do. But equally, spammers and telemarketers are using this at scale to collect this information and bombard us with spam emails. I think the draft actually very well addresses very well by allowing these exceptions.
So I have around 14 visiting cards on my table. Should I now secure it or keep it like that?
I think you should secure it.
Okay, thanks.
As a public good, you should secure it. All of us should be a lot more vigilant about the accidental privacy harms that we can do. I think Ramakanth mentioned that, collecting anonymized information, but I think Kris has also mentioned this. It can always be re-identified. So we've got to be really mindful of this world that we are in, not just for the legal reason, but because I think it is an important thing right now.
And one question of Mr. Mohan Krishnan on Vahan. I think Kris has responded to this. We have to go back to the license to drive on public roads. This is a right given to you through driver's license. And along with this, we give up some privacy and take on responsibility of not causing harm. So if the police actually can find out, it's not a leakage of personal information. Okay, with this, I think in the interest of time, we have taken 20 more minutes today, 25 more minutes. I think it's a very, very interesting session. Thank you all. Thank you first, Abhishek ji, for organizing such a wonderful event. Thank you, Gopalakrishnan sir, for giving that wonderful keynote. And of course, all the panelists for making this a very, very interesting session. And I request all panelists to open up their videos so that we take one photograph at the remembrance of this wonderful virtual event. Abhishek, will you?
Yeah, I've taken the photographs, and we will have the videos also live on the portal as well as on our Digital India and the India AI portal. So on behalf of the entire team, I thank Professor Kamakoti for conducting this panel discussion in such an animated way, and it brought out almost all the issues. And I also thank Kris Gopalakrishnan for his keynote and his remarks during the panel discussion. And thank all the panelists, Rahul, Matthan, Varad, Pande, Sidharth Shetty, Geetha, Manjunath, and Ramakanth, Vempati. This was a very engaging session. And thanks a lot for doing this for RAISE 2020. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.